Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie Moab Investigation Part 5. Third, contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt emphasizes with Gabby, stating that he was going to speak to her frankly and states that he sees her like his own daughter, who he has similar in age. Officer Pratt also says he is going to speak to her not so much like a suspect, but a victim who's dealing with a lot of issues in her personal life. Officer Pratt talks about the actions of both of them contributing to the circumstances, and stating the actions were due to her inability to cope with her anxiety and other issues she is having. Officer Pratt states that Gabby is a victim of her issues, and he felt like she would have done better in the situation if she possessed the skills to be able to handle it better, but was lacking in those skills. Officer Pratt states that based on what she said, the witness said, and Brian, despite trying his hardest to keep her out of trouble, that Brian has marks on him that the witness state was caused by her actions towards him. Officer Pratt explains the fact that they can't discriminate against him because she is a smaller female and he could easily defend himself against her. Officer Pratt goes into discretion and what is and isn't allowed under Utah law. Officer Pratt specifically talks about the law and how officers don't have discretion. All they can do is determine who the primary aggressor is, and that person must be charged. Officer Pratt explains to Gabby that they are trying to get Brian a room for the night and that she would be able to take the van to avoid going to jail, further explaining that Gabby wouldn't qualify for a room since she is the primary aggressor and suspect in this instance. Officer Pratt explains to Gabby that she would be getting a citation and that she would have a court date that she would need to attend online. Gabby becomes physically emotional and asks, "So I need to come back to Utah?" And Officer Pratt explains that she would be able to attend the hearing online. Gabby asks if she can just get a ticket for something else. I believe she says for hitting the curb. Gabby is pleading with Officer Pratt, stating that they are okay. Officer Pratt explains that if he could, he would just give them both warnings and tell them to stop hitting each other, but that they don't have that discretion. Officer Pratt stated normally someone would be going to jail, but they are trying to work it out that she could take the van and Brian could go elsewhere. Gabby asked if it was only because someone said they saw something, and Officer Pratt told Gabby that there were 2 witnesses, and one witness is confirmed to be consistent with what she said to happen as well as Brian. Gabby is crying and says, "I don't want to be separated." Gabby continues to get emotional, begging for a driving ticket, and that this is going to cause so much anxiety. Officer Pratt states that the best thing he could do is call his supervisor to see if he is missing something. Gabby is pleading, stating she will pay for any type of driving or parking ticket. Officer Pratt asked her to try and calm down, and he was going to call a supervisor. Officer Pratt reiterated that he didn't think there was anything he would be able to do, but he would see if a supervisor would tell him something he may be missing. Gabby continued crying, stating she couldn't be alone and wouldn't be able to handle it. Officer Pratt walks back to his vehicle where he calls his supervisor. Contact with Supervisor Assistant Chief Braden Palmer. Officer Pratt tells Assistant Chief Palmer that a tiny little 22-year-old girl slapped her fiancé multiple times and he has a mark on his jaw. Pratt says one witness statement was consistent with Gabby's statement as well as Brian's statement. Pratt tells the story of Gabby getting pissed off that he's trying to separate from her and she's not staying away from him. There are severe anxiety problems. He locks her out of the van telling her to go for a walk and cool off. She forced her way in the van, clawing her way past him to be with him. He's shoving her and tries to keep her out of the van, and she's punching, slapping, everything. She's 105 pounds soaking wet, 22 years old, full of anxiety, and having a really tough time. I'm not making excuses. It's written in the code. We have a domestic assault here. He's not wanting to pursue it, very adamant against pursuing it. We don't have discretion on these things. Give them a no contact. See if the safe haven place will give him a room. Leave her with the van so we don't need to put her in jail. She's really struggling with not being alone without him, and they want to be together. I told her there's not anything I can do. This is all written in statute. I said the last thing I can do is call a supervisor where this is such a minor. This was like a slap fight and injuries from like a fingernail. I just don't know if it's worth the whole domestic thing or not. If it's going to get us in trouble, if we don't do it this way, and then the supervisor's talking, you can't hear. Well, they don't want to, but unless I get some kind of permission some other way, we have to separate you. Supervisor's talking, they can't hear it. And then as far as domestic assault charge, what do you think about that? And then he says, well, I mean, do the whole thing or not. He cut himself off. Supervisor talking, can't hear. But is there a way of not doing something like this? I mean, it's so minor. It's hard to say right. I'm going to go reread the statute and just see if it fits, or if there's a way it doesn't fit, and if I can find a way that cause it really is the spirit of the law is being lost on this one. It really is. So let me see what I can find out, and if nothing else, then we'll have to separate them, whether she likes it or not. And then the supervisor says something to him you can't hear, and he says, all right, thanks, bye. Looking up the code, the second conversation with Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt looks up the code and says, bodily injury means physical pain, illness, or any impairment of physical condition. So let's see. He's not ill, he doesn't have an impairment or physical condition, and if he's not in pain, he asked Officer Robbins, how far do you want to go with this? You know, why the domestic assault code is there. It's there to protect people. The reason why they don't give us discretion in these things is that too many times women who are at risk want to go back to their abuser, just want him to stop, and don't want to have to be separated, don't want him charged, don't want him to go to jail, and the treatment gets worse and worse, and they end up being killed. In no way, shape, or form that I can perceive does what happened here, a little slap fight between fiancés who love each other and want to be together, can I perceive that this is going to digress into a situation where he's going to be a battered man, and then again, I don't have a crystal ball. And he goes on to say that he talked with Assistant Chief to see if there was any way to go less than the full force domestic assault route, and he says, look, either go all the way or don't. Officer Pratt said he asked, under what circumstances can I not? The only time I cannot is if it doesn't fit. And if it fits, then it's in the law that you have to do it. Officer Pratt explains that he went and looked at the code for assault, and he talks about how they both know what assault is, but talks about how valuable it is to look it up and read it word for word. Officer Pratt then reads the statute for assault. They start talking about the specific verbiage in the code, specifically about its meaning, the intent to do bodily injury, and Officer Pratt then looked up the definition of bodily injury in Utah and reads it again, which he did previously. Robbins points out that Brian had a swollen right eye, and Officer Pratt tells Robbins that the result didn't matter. It was about the intent, and if she intended to cause him pain, illness, or impairment of physical condition. Officer Robbins asked if the definition included attempt and intent or attempt or intent, and Pratt replies stating, when you're attempting to do something, you have to intend to do it. Pratt insinuates the intent is synonymous with attempt. Pratt asks Officer Robbins what was her intent, and Pratt tells Officer Robbins to speak with Gabby and ask her questions regarding the intent behind her actions, stating that whatever Gabby answers will seal her fate. The officers then go to Gabby to speak with her further. Fourth contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt tells Gabby that he has a question for her, and how she answered the question determined what happened next, and further stating that she was the only one that could answer the question. Pratt continues to tell her, think very hard before you answer the question. Pratt asks Gabby, when you slapped him those times, were you attempting to cause him physical pain or physical impairment? Gabby answers immediately, shaking her head side to side, stating no. Pratt asks Gabby, well, what were you attempting to do? What was the reason behind the slapping and stuff? What were you attempting to accomplish by slapping him? And Gabby replies, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. And Pratt then says out loud, well, it doesn't sound like to me she attempted to injure him. Pratt then tells Robbins, it's your call. It's 100% your call. I support you either way. Pratt then walks away from Officer Robbins, approaches him a moment later, and is also joined by the female park ranger. Officer Robbins states that he doesn't entirely believe her. Officer Robbins goes on to explain that Gabby had admitted to striking Brian in the arm earlier, which Brian acknowledged. The female park ranger confirms that what she was told by Gabby was that Brian was looking at Gabby when Gabby struck him, which was the reason why there were no marks on Brian's face that was closest to the window. The female park ranger said Gabby told her that she wasn't trying to hurt Brian, but that Brian just wasn't listening to her, and it was her fault Brian hit the curb because she was distracting him. Officer Pratt goes on to explain what assault is and defined in the code book, and again brings up what the code states bodily injury means. Pratt reminds the others he is recording and states society, judges, everyone can judge him for this. Pratt states he is looking at a 110-pound female with her fiancé, and they have no means to be separated. Pratt states Brian doesn't want to pursue it, and that she is not a threat to him more than slight abrasions from her fingernails. Pratt states he doesn't care if they use the actual letter of the law to not charge. I also don't care. It literally makes perfect sense to go full-on domestic assault. Pratt tells Robbins it is his decision and states he would support him either way. Officer Robbins states that he is going to do a crime report on it, and he won't charge right now. Send it off to the city attorney and let them screen it for charges. Pratt tells him that if he does that and they strongly disagree with his decision and they throw a complete fit, you might hear about it in a very negative way. Pratt then suggests that Robbins make a decision yourself. The female park ranger states that she would rather be dinged for a decision I made than a decision I didn't make. And Pratt states, especially if they think you were completely negligent in your decision. Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he completely supports him in whatever decision he makes, even if they go as far as taking her to jail. At this point, a call is coming through, and Officer Pratt states he better take this. Officer Robbins states that he will make the decision and states that he is going to cite and go through the process. Officer Pratt asks him if he feels more comfortable taking the other call. Robbins is hesitant either way and states it's basically 50-50. Pratt tells Robbins that he could also separate them for the night and take no action. Pratt tells Robbins that if they find each other again, he still separated them and provided for Brian's safety. Pratt tells him that if they find each other again, then it's on him. The female park ranger states, "You can babysit them all night." Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins, "You can separate them and tell them to let it cool off until tomorrow. If they don't let it cool off and we hear about it, we'll hear about it." Officer Pratt says, "If there is continued fighting going on, you already were Mr. Nice Guy. You already gave them a chance. What you can't do by law is separate someone and say, if we hear from you again, we're going to arrest one of you." Stating that if any of them really need help, they may not call the police and you can't threaten them with that. Officer Pratt continues telling Officer Robbins to go full or nothing and somewhere in between and separate them, and stating, and kind of give them a nod, the wink, like, hey, stay separated, it's up to you. Officer Pratt then tells Officer Robbins he is going to go handle the call that just came in. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he has very capable help with him and that he trusts him. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins to call if he has any problems. He gets in his vehicle, he clears the call, and states that he is en route to the intoxicated male call. Officer Daniel Scott Robbins. The video starts with the officer stating that the driver of the van was showing some obscure driving and possibly intoxicated, and he stated that he was going about 45 miles an hour and the speed limit in that area was 25 miles an hour. He then reported the van just hit the curb and stated the speed limit was actually 15 miles per hour. Initial contact with both occupants. He asked Brian to place the van into park and to set the keys on the dash. He asked for the names and asked Gabby why she was crying. Gabby states that they have been fighting this morning, stating there have been personal issues. Brian states it has been a long day and stated they were camping yesterday and apologized for hitting the curb. And then Gabby states, "I was distracting him from driving, I'm sorry." He asked Gabby to step out of the van and asked Brian if he can set the keys on the hood of the car, and Brian provides the keys to the officer. Initial contact alone with Gabby. He notifies dispatch he has the female separated from the male. He asks Gabby what happened. Gabby is crying and states that she has really bad OCD and was straightening up the van and apologizing to Brian for being so mean, because sometimes she has OCD and sometimes she gets really frustrated. She stated she was apologizing to Brian for being in a bad mood. Gabby stated she had so much work she was doing on her computer this morning, and the officer asked what she does for work, and Gabby stated that she used to work at an organic juice bar as a nutritionalist but quit her job to travel across the country and is trying to start a blog. She said she had been building her website and has been really stressed and stated that Brian really doesn't believe that she can do it, any of it. And that was upsetting. Gabby states that they have been fighting all morning and Brian wouldn't let her in the car before. Officer Robbins asked why Brian wouldn't let her in the van, and Gabby said that Brian told her she needed to calm down. Gabby goes on to say she is perfectly calm all of the time and states that Brian really stresses her out and said this has just been a rough morning. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that he is going to place her in the back of his car, stating that at this time she isn't in any trouble and isn't going to be in handcuffs. He tells her that she will have air conditioning and allow her time to take a breath and relax a little bit, and then he will return later on and talk to her. He then puts her in his patrol car and returns to the van. Initial contact with Brian assisted by a male park ranger. Brian asks if he was just talking with his fiancée, which he confirms. Officer Robbins asks Brian to step out of the van so they can talk. Officer Robbins asks Brian what was going on, and Brian states that Gabby gets really worked up sometimes, and he tries to distance himself from her. Brian stated he locked the car and walked away from her. Brian continues, stated that what happened this morning was Gabby was trying to start up her own website and blog, and said that he gave her time, but then started saying that they had a nice morning. Brian stated that she got worked up as they were trying to get their day going and go to Arches. Officer Robbins asked Brian to tell him about the scratches that are on his face, and Brian replies that she had her cell phone in her hand, and that's why I was pushing her away. Brian talks about locking the van and walking away and suggesting that they take a breather. Brian stated that was the only way to calm down from it, and stated that Gabby was getting worked up. Brian said Gabby had her phone and was trying to get the keys, and that is when he was pushing her away. Brian said he knew that he shouldn't push her, but stated he was just trying to push her away, stating again that they needed to take a minute and step back and breathe. And then he pointed out to the area near his right eye and said, "She got me with her phone." Officer Robbins asked to look at Brian's hand and points out a scratch on his left hand, and Brian states that's from a wire. Officer Robbins asked Brian about hitting the curb, and Brian states while demonstrating that hitting the curb was from Gabby grabbing and turning the wheel. Brian said Gabby said, "I can't believe we're getting pulled over," and grabbed the wheel. Officer Robbins asked about his speed, and Brian states he knew he was going fast and said it was probably from the adrenaline of getting pulled over and Gabby grabbing the wheel, and said he was still shaken up. Brian said if he sped up, then he was sorry about that, and Brian added if he was speeding beforehand, he was also sorry about that. Officer Robbins stated that it took him a little bit to catch up, and Brian apologized, stating that he was headed into the park to get water, stating they have a 6-gallon water container to fill up for their upcoming hike. Brian continued stating that he was trying to keep everything calm and quiet because there was still plenty of time to go for their hike. Officer Robbins asked Brian to sit on the curb after ensuring that there were no weapons on him. Officer Robbins asked Brian for his ID, to which he said it was in the van. Officer Robbins said that was okay and collected his name and date of birth. He then runs the information through dispatch. Officer Robbins then goes and stands next to Officer Pratt, who is still interviewing Gabby. The interaction while standing with Officer Pratt is already documented. Officer Pratt walks away to speak with Brian, and Officer Robbins continues the interview with Gabby. Officer Robbins states that he heard Gabby say she was hitting Brian in the arm while they were driving. Robbins asked Gabby if she grabbed the steering wheel at all, and Gabby stated she did not touch the steering wheel, but only for like a second. "I just saw the lights come on," and demonstrated the punch she did to Brian while stating, "You're an idiot." Officer Robbins asked again if she grabbed the steering wheel at all, and she shook her head side to side, stating, No, I didn't touch the steering wheel at all." Officer Robbins stated he is going to shut the door and ask Gabby if she had enough air or if she needed him to turn it up. Gabby asked Officer Robbins for water. Officer Robbins walks away and asks the female park ranger if she has any water, and then walks over to Brian, who is speaking with Officer Pratt and the male park ranger. Second interaction with Brian. Officer Robbins asked Brian to start at the beginning and tell him again what happened. Brian stated they have been inaudible for the last week or so and stated the flies have been pretty intense and stated that the flies have definitely been getting to her, further stating that his feet are also dirty. He stated their little squabble started while they were hanging out at the coffee shop, and when they got back in the van, there was some little dirt at the back of the van. Brian stated he moved their food around and, interrupted by the female officer taking a drink to Gabby, they asked Brian if he needed water, and Brian stated he didn't like plastic bottles. He continued with the story. Brian stated there was a little disagreement there, and he continues stating this was at the beginning and added again that Gabby was getting a little worked up. Officer Robbins asked what the disagreement was about, and Brian then stated he wouldn't even call it a disagreement, but stated again that he had dirty feet and stated they were at the coffee shop for so long, stating that they were there from about 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. and stated that it was a few little things, adding they were relationship things, and stated to Officer Robbins that he didn't know if Officer Robbins was in a relationship, but again stated it was just little relationship things. Brian continues stating that they weren't physical before the point Brian said to let's just take a breather, and stated he would lock the van up and they would each go for a walk about a block in different directions and then come back to the van. Brian stated she was worked up and had her phone in her hand as well as her keys, then added it wasn't the keys, it was her phone and her rings that were on her fingers. Brian stated he had the keys because he didn't want her to go anywhere. He said he didn't have his phone and then said he doesn't really have a phone and was worried about her leaving him, then he would be left on his own. Brian continued stating that he said, let's just go for a walk, and stated Gabby was trying to get the keys from him, and that is when he demonstrated pushing her away and stated, that is when she hit me. Brian stated he didn't get really physical, but stated he was just trying to push her away and not get hit. Brian said this is when he got really loud and stated this is probably when they drew everyone's attention, was when he was yelling, back up, get away, give me just a... Officer Robbins asked about the scratches near his eye and asked what caused that. Brian stated it was the phone. Officer Robbins tried clarifying by stating that Brian pushed her and then she hit him. Brian corrected him and said Gabby had already jumped on him and was swinging when he pushed her, and added that she had a lot of rings and nails which would have caused the injuries. The male park ranger points out there are scratches on the left side of his neck, on the left side of his nose, a scratch near the center of his face, and a bruising bleeding on the right side of his head. Officer Robbins then asked Brian to pull up his right sleeve and notices further injury near his right bicep and tricep. Officer Robbins asked what the injury is from, and Brian stated, I suppose fingernails, but I'm not complaining. Officer Robbins asked if it is bruised or tender, and Brian states no. And he continues by saying, I'm fine, and I love Gabby. I hope she doesn't have too many complaints about me, while pointing towards the direction that she is at. Brian added that he felt bad about getting so loud and stated he was just trying to get some distance. He said, I was trying to make her calm down, and said he pointed out to her that everyone's watching. Officer Robbins then leaves to go talk with Officer Pratt, but he is busy, and he returns to Brian and said he has some more questions. Officer Robbins asked Brian if he has any medications, and Brian stated he doesn't, but said Gabby has told him in the past that he should take Xanax or something like that because he has high anxiety. Officer Robbins asked if he is normally hyper, and Brian asked if he seems like he is. Brian stated his heart rate jumped when he saw the lights. The male park ranger asked, and Officer Robbins asked if Gabby takes any medications that he is aware of. Brian replies while laughing, "She's just crazy," then immediately dismisses it and says he was just kidding. Brian stated Gabby doesn't take any medication that he's aware of. Officer Robbins leaves Brian and walks back to Gabby. Second contact with Gabby. Officer Robbins asks Gabby for her personal information and runs her through dispatch. He misspells her last name and walks back to where Brian is. Third contact with Brian. While he is waiting to hear back from dispatch, there is a small talk with Brian and the male park ranger about irrelevant stuff that isn't even worth documenting. Officer Pratt returns to Officer Robbins and states he just spoke to the witness, and they go off together to discuss what the witness stated. Conversation between the officers. This information is already documented from the prior video observations. After speaking together, they both walk over to Brian and continue talking with him together, which is already documented. They are there together until 13:15 when Officer Robbins makes a phone call to try and get arrangements for Brian to have somewhere to stay. Phone call. Officer Robbins makes the phone call and returns to Brian and Officer Pratt. Fourth contact with Brian. Officer Robbins returns to Brian while Officer Pratt is now speaking with Gabby. He tells Brian that they are making arrangements for him to have a place to stay, and Brian is obviously physically emotional about it and thankful for the help. Officer Robbins starts emphasizing with Brian and brings up his own relationship and the anxiety between him and his wife. Brian adds that sometimes he just has to walk away. Officer Robbins states he isn't going to try and give him life advice as Brian has been on this earth almost as long as he has. Officer Robbins apologizes for everything that has happened to Brian and Gabby and Brian. Brian is thankful and asks if he can make himself a little bag of stuff if they are going to be taking him somewhere. The male park ranger assists Brian with this while Officer Robbins returns to Officer Pratt and the female park ranger. This information is already documented. They are together until 36:27 when he gets a phone call. Second phone call. The phone call is with the person that they are using to help get a room for Brian. He provides the person Brian's information with a brief synopsis of what had occurred. He is on the phone and advises she will be getting charged with domestic assault and a protective order will be temporarily in place. He is on the phone call for a few minutes and then returns to the van to speak with Brian. Fifth contact with Brian. He explains that since he is a victim in this case, he asks about taking photos of the injuries Brian sustained from the incident. The officer is taking photographs when the female park ranger walks up and asks about getting Gabby's cell phone. Brian gets the cell phone for the park ranger and then returns where more photographs are taken. He takes pictures of his face, his arm, hands, and neck. He then asks Brian to lift his shirt so he can see if there is any further injuries. When he lifts his shirt up, it looks like there is a long red scratch or scar underneath his left pec, but the other officer doesn't take a picture of it. He explains to Brian he is still working on getting Brian a place to stay, and it will be a bit longer before they can secure that. He explains that they will still have a few minutes that they need to cite Gabby and provide her with the information she will need. He leaves Brian to the male park ranger and then walks back and makes contact with the female park ranger. The female park ranger stated the female was calling her parents to try and feel better. She said that Gabby doesn't want to have to spend a night without Brian and was struggling. The officer stated she didn't have a choice in the matter, and the female park ranger agreed and said the other officer went to call a supervisor. Officer Robbins returned to the vehicle where Officer Pratt is, where they have a conversation about the code verbiage, and this information is already documented in the notes above. Conversation between two officers. They speak until 48:46 and then go back to Gabby. Third contact with Gabby. They return and speak with Gabby, and this information is also already documented in the notes above. They are there until Officer Pratt leaves for another call at 54:34. 6. Contact with Brian. Officer Robbins gets a picture of his driver's license and collects his phone number. Brian shows the officer his phone that has the number. Interesting, whereas before he stated he didn't really have a phone. Officer Robbins leaves and returns to Gabby. 4th contact with Gabby. He collects Gabby's phone number and asks for her ID, which is still in the van. Gabby tells Officer Robbins where it is at, and the female park ranger walks towards the van. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that he has decided not to cite her for domestic violence assault, and that she isn't getting charged with anything. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that he does have to separate them tonight and wants them away from each other where they can relax. Officer Robbins tells her that she will be taking the van and that Brian is getting lined up with a hotel room. He tells them to stay away from one another. He said he wants them to have a chance to get away from each other, breathe, and talk to their parents, etc. Female park ranger returns, and Officer Robbins gets a picture of her ID. At 58:19, he gets a phone call and walks away. 3rd phone call. The phone call doesn't last long, and it sounded like there was a place across from a 7-Eleven that was mentioned, Bowen's. 5th contact with Gabby. He returns again and tells Gabby that Brian has a hotel room for the night. He tells Gabby he has to keep them separated, but states that he can pass a message to him if she would like. He asks if Gabby wants him to tell Brian she loves him, and she'll see him tomorrow. Gabby agrees to tell Officer Brian to tell Brian not to forget the phone charger. 7th contact with Brian. Officer Robbins returns to Brian and tells him that he had a hotel room for him tonight. Brian is appreciative. Officer Robbins tells Brian that Gabby said she did not intend to hurt him when she was slapping at him, so, technically speaking, it does not fit the letter of the code. So he is not charging her with a domestic violence assault case. He tells Brian that he is releasing them both, but didn't want them seeing each other tonight. He tells Brian that Gabby agreed to it, and he told Brian to take the opportunity to take some time for themselves tonight. Officer Robbins then tells Brian that Gabby said she loves him and to not forget a cell phone charger. Officer Robbins asks Brian to not have any communication with Gabby tonight, and then says to try and not have any contact with each other tonight. 6th contact with Gabby. He then asks Brian to stand by the park ranger's truck as he was going to walk Gabby over to the van. Officer returns to Gabby and tells her to not communicate with Brian tonight unless there is earth-shattering emergency news. He said Brian is going to the hotel, and he gives Gabby the keys to the van. Gabby asked if it was going to be a far drive for her to get to him in the morning, and Officer tells her that he isn't going to say where he is going, and Gabby said that was fine. Gabby was just concerned as she doesn't usually drive the van, and she wanted to make sure it wasn't too far. The officer is walking Gabby over to the van and stops her and tells her where she can go to get a list of places to go to shower if she is looking for a place to do that. He wishes Gabby well and reminds her not to communicate with Brian tonight and leaves Gabby with the van. 8th contact with Brian. He returns to Brian and tells him to go ahead and jump in the back seat of his vehicle. Officer Robbins thanks the park rangers for the help. He gets in the vehicle and lets dispatch know he is taking the mail to the Bowden Hotel, or Bowden Hotel. I don't know. He tells Brian that it was his request, but not legally required to hold to it. That he asked them not to communicate that night. He then has a conversation and talking about his own wife and her anxiety and what helps her, and tried to help Gabby with some suggestions. Talked about his wife being on medication and stated that within a week, his wife was considerably different and made her quality of life much better. He asked how long Brian and Gabby had been together, and Brian stated that they have known each other since high school, but said that they have been together for 3 years. Not sure I heard him say 3, but I didn't know the rest. The car ride they have small talk, talking about driving, places they've been. Brian brings up the Appalachian Trail. Brian said they were going to be headed to Oregon to visit one of her family members or friends. Brian asked about national parks to visit, where they talk about multiple parks in California. Drops him off, and that just ends like that, which is odd. Okay, 911 audio, radio, traffic notes, 911 audio. Reporting party wants to report a domestic dispute. The dispatcher asks what they were doing, and the caller states, "We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl." He said they stopped and the two ran up and down the sidewalk, where he proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off. The caller describes the vehicle with the license plate, and the dispatcher asked for his name, which he states is redacted. Dispatch asks for his phone number, which is redacted. Dispatch confirms the direction of travel. The dispatcher beeps the tone and alerts law enforcement about a male hitting a female and then leaving the area of the Moonflower and heading north on Main Street, and provides the vehicle description. Officer Pratt asks for the phone number of the reporting party, which is relayed back to the officer. An officer states they spoke to another witness who stated there was a full-sized backpack attached to the rear of the vehicle as well. Officer Pratt states he is clear the Moonflower and looking for the vehicle. Officer Robbins asks dispatch to run both occupants, both returning with dispatch not ever able to find driver's license information. Information on the female was incorrect as far as name spelling. Thank you so much for listening. We would truly appreciate a thumbs up or even a thumbs down if you feel so inclined. And until next time, this is Unjustified.